To start our next speaker. So I'm going to introduce this in my own weird way, okay, because what Sarah is talking about today is very close to my heart, because I use the Orphic hymns on a daily basis to invoke the planets of the day, and my absolute favourite one, I use the Thomas Taylor translation because it's easy to remember. So my favourite one is boisterous, magnanimous and encumbered Mars, in darts rejoicing and in bloody wars, fierce and untamed, the mighty walls from their foundations shake, mortal destroying king defiled with gore, pleased with bloody, something about war, I've forgotten what it is now, but it's the way that the hymns are phrased that invokes the planets, all right? And I love the fact that Sarah has written a manual on them, and I'm going to go and buy the book because I know I'm going to miss out if I don't. So I'm going to hand you over to Sarah.
Thank you so much. Hi everybody, my name is Sara Mastros. Today I'm going to talk about the Orphic hymns. I'm going to move along at a pretty brisk pace. Please feel free to interrupt me at any time with questions. Like, I will stop and take questions at the end, but it will actually go faster if you ask your question, like, when it comes up. Also, I'm going to say, I'm going to veer off the slides a little bit, because there were things other people said that, like, opened my heart to new ideas to talk about, right? But, I'm pushing a button, but nothing is happening.
Rob.
There we go. Did I do that, or did you do that? Okay. So, today we're going to talk about, we are in fact going to start off with an invocation of Orpheus. But before we do that, I'm going to talk a little bit sort of about why, right? So, I think we often think of Orphism, right, as something that occurred in ancient Greece. And that's not false, but Orphism is a living tradition. For thousands of years, there have never been a time when there were not degenerate cults of magician bards who called themselves Orphics and in the name of Orpheus did bard magic. Like, this is in fact a living tradition that has wound its way in very complicated ways through most of Western magic, right? And so I want to talk a little bit, I'm going to talk about the Orphic hymns sort of in that context. Like, what does it mean to be Orphic today? And what does it mean to sort of bring the Orphic hymns into other kinds of magical practice, right? So M.L. West tells us that the only way you can really sort of define Orphism is that, let me see if I get it perfect. As for Orphism, the only definite meaning that can be given to the term is a fashion for claiming Orpheus as an authority, right? And that's at the heart of what Orphism is, right? If you work magic made out of words, right? Out of sound made into shape, right? Breath brought to life, right? That's bard magic. That's the essence of bard magic, in my opinion, right? And if you are doing that in the name of Orpheus, that's Orphism, right? That is the most central sort of criteria by which we can judge what Orphism is or isn't. But Orphism also has this really complex sort of historical context, right? I said I was going to jump around. This is what I want to do. I want to talk about this a little bit first, right? So I want to talk about who Orpheus is, and then we're going to go back and do an invocation of him, right? Sort of bring him into the room with us and talk about him, right? So there are four sort of primordial bards in ancient Greece, right? Of those, Orpheus is the eldest, generally. So Orpheus, right? I'm going to assume people generally know who all of these people are. I'm going to come back and talk about Orpheus' myth in great detail, right? Musaeus is, I would imagine, the one there that people are maybe least familiar with. Some people say that Musaeus was Orpheus' teacher. Some people say that Musaeus was Orpheus' son. I assume his son was named after his teacher, and that we're talking about both of those people, right? So Musaeus, by the way, some people claim is Moses. I think I'm a little sketchy about that, but it's like a cool thing to think about, right? It's not, and a way to talk about is to say that, like, by the time that we're sort of hearing about this idea of these four great rivers, like, I didn't invent that idea, right? By the time we're doing that, Moses is in fact woven into into Greek culture, right? That Hellenic Judaism is in fact one of the roots of what we think of as Orphism today, despite the fact that Orphism begins much earlier than that, right? So Homer, I think we're probably all familiar with. Important to understand that Homer is sort of marking a transition as we go through these 4 bards, right? That Orpheus, look, I'm going to talk to you a lot about Orpheus. I'm going to invite Orpheus into this room. I have a direct personal, like, I am so far over that boggle threshold. Like, I live on the wrong side of those tracks. But, like, I don't think anybody is really going to claim that Orpheus, the way I am talking about him, the way we talk about him today, is like a specific person who lived at a specific moment in time, right? Homer also is not a specific person, but it's like much closer to being, right? So we generally understand Homer to be sort of a collection of specific living bards, like sort of working in some ways collaboratively, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean they're contemporaries, but they're informed by each other's work, developing this body of work that we attribute to someone named Homer. Homer, although we are familiar with it in a written context, is almost certainly a much older oral tradition, right? And then we have sort of who we think of as sort of the final, right, great bard of ancient Greece, and that's Hesiod. And Hesiod, we can say, is almost certainly is a very specific person writing in a specific time and place. I don't want to veer off too far into Hesiod, because I'll talk about Hesiod all day if you let me. But like, one of the reasons we know that is because in some of his books, particularly in the Works and Days, there's like some biographical information at the beginning, like, oh, my dad, when I was little, moved to this shithole town in the middle of nowhere, and I don't like it here, but there's this great mountain, and now my brother is suing me over our inheritance, and those are not the sort of details you would expect to be preserved in an oral tradition, right? Like, Hesiod is a particular person speaking in a particular voice. And we have this sort of transition, right, from the fully mythic, right, through something that we might think of as like hagiographic, into like a living people doing this, right, throughout history, and particularly like, there are many things that all of us in this room share, but in some ways the most central one is that we're all speaking English today, right? Like, there's this cultural heritage, like, I did not grow up in Britain, right? My ancestors are not from Britain, but I speak English, right? As does, I assume, everyone in this room listening to me speak English, right? And so in this Anglophone tradition, right, Orphism is wound the whole way through it, right? As soon as there was English, there were people who were writing poetry, magical, degenerate, drug and orgy-laced poetry, which is the essence of Orphism, right? We'll talk about that. There are other ways to think about it, but like, I don't know, if you're sober and celibate and don't write poetry, are you an Orphic though? They're central to it, right? And there's always been this tradition. As soon as there was an English language, there were people doing Orphism in English who understood what they themselves were doing in the context of the mythic Orpheus, right? So this is a living tradition, and that's sort of what I want to talk about, is what Orphism looks like today. Obviously, I have my own viewpoint on that, right? So Orpheus, right, we have these 4 central myths about him. In a moment, I'm going to tell them to you in verse, right? I sort of have them in order here by the time that they sort of arise. Like, when do we know that myth from, right? But that is not this to say that's the order they were invented in, nor is it to say, like, that's the order they occur in Orpheus's life, right? So different ways of ordering them. But in some ways, the oldest myth we know is actually his death, right? We know that he was murdered by Maenads. The word Maenad here is someone whose sacred trance is mania. Like, that's what it means to be a Maenad. It means that your divine energy is what in English we would call mania, the possession, like the inspiration, the inspiritation, right? Ecstasis, you are out of the static world in this ecstatic trance, and the specific ecstatic trance of a Maenad is what we call mania, right? Which in ancient Greece they would probably call nympholepty, being captured by the fairies, is how I would translate nympholepty, right? So we have this murder. He was murdered by Maenads, and then his head will turn into an oracle. That's a story we know about Orpheus, right? We know that in the Argonautica, right, in the story of Jason and the Argonauts going to seize the Golden Fleece, Orpheus is on that boat. He's their bard, right? I think probably the myth that most people know about Orpheus, right, is the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, or in Latin we would say Orfeo and Eurydice, right? And in some ways that's the one that I think is central to understanding him as a magician, right? We'll talk about that a little bit later. right? But he goes down into the other place and comes back up alive, and that's some magician shit, right? And then finally we have this idea that he studied in Egypt. Someone, Bob, in the back talked about how, like, Greek, that's where you learn magic in ancient Greece, is you go to Egypt, right? So Orpheus goes to Egypt, he comes back, mythologically he planted the cult of Hecate, right, on the island of Aegina. I believe that what that myth is talking about is the goddess we would now call Athena Athaya. But the Athena there is really just like a political flex by Athens, like, oh no, your goddess belongs to us now. Like, that's why that goddess is named Athena. She's not mythically similar to Athena in any way, right? And so when Mara was talking, right, about how that happened with Welsh gods as well, right? They get sort of, but that happens everywhere, right? And so in the Greek gods, that's, like, it's Athens doing that usually. If you take nothing else from this talk, sort of a piece I want you to remember is that almost all Greek mythology you are familiar with is very much coming to you through a lens of Athenian political propaganda, right? And that Orphism is on the wrong side of that political propaganda, right? So we have this sort of idea of Orpheus that's made out of this mythology, and the core of it is that he is a bard magician who goes down to the land of the dead and comes back, right? So I'm gonna sort of read you his mythology in verse. So this is just my verse. This is not an Orphic hymn, except in the sense that Orphism is a living tradition and this is a hymn to Orpheus. So in any reasonable context, it is an Orphic hymn, right? Listen to the tale of the poet most renowned, hero and mystic, weaving magic made from sound, Orpheus, an orphan slave from ever-blessed Thrace, whose ecstatic, charismatic rites crack open heaven's face under peal of thunder drums, revealing a path from trance to grace. The song of son of songstress muse, high prophet of all harmonics, archaic storytelling bard hooked on heaven's phonics, great cosmic voice that opens up the heavenly abode, poetic oracle and orator, our hero in rhapsody rose swift to fame and fortune for the stories that he told. He spoke the language of the birds and sang them from their trees. He sailed the seas out to the east to seize the golden fleece. He raised the sailor's spirits, sang the fish up from the seas. He outsang the siren's serenade, thus besting bitter banshees. Some say it was at a wedding. Oh, hair's coming off apparently. Some say it was at a wedding and he met his soul's true love, the Princess Eurydice called Justice wide above. But she was bitten by a viper and he held her wailing woe as her soul flickered and fled and made its descent and left him all alone. Others say she was immortal, her descent not deathly lost, that she is Queen Hecate, hidden in patriarchal gloss. In any case, brave Orpheus saw his love below the dark. He crossed the river of life and death, the true magician's mark. With 7 songs for 7 steps, he charmed his way below, through the dark and cold and death and leafy into the earth's hollow. The queen of hell fell under his spell, enchanted by the sound, and he found his love where she lay bound beneath the ancient mound. With further songs and spells, he charmed the guardian of the dead, cracking locks and rolling rocks where sorry, it's been a long day. Cracking locks and rolling rocks that blocked where justice laid her head. The queen gave leave to lead his love back up above the ground. But Orpheus, she said to him, you mustn't turn around. Orpheus, still young and brash, failed the Dark Queen's test. So Hecate Eurydice sleeps in Persephone's blessed breast. In impotent goetic woe, Orpheus returned to wild Thrace and once again gained widespread fame for his voice and pretty face. But he wallowed in bitter fury and forswore she who was his love. He blasphemed the queen below and worshipped only him above. He taught his men to oppress women and engage in child rape. I want to be clear, like, there's a footnote here that you guys can't see. That is well-established Orphic mythology. That's not like me putting some feminism on top of it. That's straight up how this story goes, is that Orpheus is the one who introduced the practice of pederasty into Athenian political social machination, right? So he taught his men to oppress women and engage in child rape, so Maenads ripped him limb from limb and took that pretty face. But with such death, his soul was cleansed. His rage was finally abated, and he came at last to his true love's arms in the dark where she had waited. Orpheus died while he yet lived. That's what makes a mage. He went below and rose again. He paid hell's steep tide wage. If you would follow in his steps, if you want to open up the ways, then dare to raise Keyholder's torch and seek wide justice always. This secret right we'll teach to you, we means Orpheus, we will teach to you if you read his hymns with care and allow illuminating dark to lay the long way bare. Mystery cannot be penetrated, she must penetrate you. Climb your way up out of hell, but keep faith with what's beneath you. So that's a hymn for Orpheus. I want to talk about a couple pieces of it, right? Oh, thank you. It's really all Orpheus, that's the trick. I just get possessed and let Orpheus do my writing for me, so it's really not me at all. So just a couple of things here. So Thrace is really sort of what we would now call maybe like Bulgaria, like the Balkans and Turkey, basically the whole region, right, is what they mean by Thrace. The name Orpheus does in fact mean orphan. So the son of songstress muse. Orpheus is widely understood to be the son of the sort of chief of the muses, Calliope, the muse of this sort of bardcraft, which they would call poetry. But, you know, what they mean by poetry in ancient Greece and what we mean by poetry, like what we are willing to call poetry is sort of a narrow selection of what in the ancient world they would call poetry, which is really includes any kind of music with lyrics, sometimes music that doesn't have lyrics, they'll even call that poetry. Really, I feel bad. So that magic drink you took out of that cauldron of Caridwen, what was it called? Aren? Awen. Yeah, in Greek we call that poetry. Like that is what they mean, right? So it's sort of the whole category of divinely inspired, moving minds and hearts, not just human minds and hearts, but human hearts with breath turned into shape, right? With sound of your voice, sort of the most essential form of human communication, right? I think a lot of times in our modern world, we sort of fall into this trap where we think about writing as somehow like the essence of language, but it is not. Language is a very, very new technological overlay on top of language, the function of which is to make the ephemeral physical, right? So Bob talked a lot about a lot of people have talked in a lot of different ways today, right? About this sort of magical zone where this sort of liminal space, right, between the physical and the extra physical, right? And at least in Greece, I think poetry is understood to be anything that opens those gates. Now, as a poet, maybe I have an opinion on it. Other people might disagree, right? I think the rest of this sort of on this slide is pretty, I would imagine, relatively familiar mythology, right? Again, Eurydice means maybe wide justice, above justice. I mean, justice wide above is a rather poetic translation, but that's what that name means, right? Okay, so this theory that Eurydice is Hecate, I like it. It's a cool romantic theory. I think it's maybe a little bit too far. I would certainly say that like the Eurydice myth sort of retells with humans, right? Stories, yeah.
It is interesting though because there's a lot of evidence that Hecate comes from Thrace originally.
Exactly, right? So that's what I want to say, right? Is that like, this is like, Orpheus's connection to Hecate is unquestionable. The connection of a story of a magician who goes, as we would say in the PGM, who went below and saw the many things, right? That's a phrase we hear in the PGM a lot. But this idea that like the central initiatory way you become a magician, particularly, right? We have a lot, like magician's kind of a vague term. In English that means a lot of things, but like sort of magic qua magic in this kind of ontology. Like there are many ways you get it, but one of them is you die and then you're not dead anymore, right? Like that's a traditional way to make a mage, right? And that kind of Catabasis underworld, like chthonic journey initiation is is central to Orpheus's myth. That is the kind of magician that Orpheus is. That is the kind of magic that Orphics do, right? So because we're often looking at Orphism sort of from this external, ontologically bracketed view, right? That like the classical myths in particular, we, like those of us who grow up speaking English and sort of hit the classical myths in kind of that like, you know, maybe pretty British, Victorian kind of ontological bracketing. That's not what those myths are when you read them, right, in the sort of context for the audience for whom they were intended, right? And so Orphism, at least the way I understand it, one of many things that it is about, right, in a modern sense, is thinking about like story and narrative and poetry as a magical act, and as a magical act that does, in fact, break down those ontological brackets. I loved every person who talked today. I'm on fire with inspiration from every single person I've spoken to, in case that doesn't check. Right? So again, this story where Orpheus goes down to save Eurydice, I think is quite familiar. And then he comes back, right? And I think maybe this is just my own feminist gloss, but I will say I think that a lot of Greek hero legend talks about what we would call PTSD, right? So for example, the Iliad, I think, is straight up a story about battle PTSD. Like that's what that book is about. And similarly, like Orpheus comes back from the dead, but he doesn't come back right. Because he lost, right? He went through an initiatory challenge and he failed. Now, I'm gonna throw this out there. He could have let Eurydice walk first. That would have solved the problem, right? Like, this is perhaps not clear to everyone, depending like how deep into Greek history you are. I wanna be clear, Athens, right? The cultural lens through which we understand ancient Greece is Taliban-level patriarchal. Like, it's not a good place to be a woman, and many of those women, right, are going to turn to, right, this new religion, Orphism, right? So a couple things about Orphism as it functioned in ancient Greece, right? Sort of the cultural context in which the Orphic hymns arise. Right, and the first one is most of what we know about Orphism comes from things like the Orphic hymns, right, which are sort of like in character, like from that movement. Maybe, I mean, again, that movement is anything where you claim Orpheus told you, so it's a little nebulous what counts and what doesn't, right? But most of what we know about it in sort of an anthropological and historical context, in a sociological context, is people who do not approve of Orphism telling us about Orphism, right? Which I think is true about a lot of paganism, right? So you were talking about how, like, we come to know this wealth mythology through this lens, right, of medieval Christianity, and what does that do to it? Like, similarly in ancient Greece, you are not hearing this from the people. In any written culture, I think it's really important to understand that, like, who gets to write things is not everyone. And the further back you go in the history of writing, the fewer and fewer people it is, because writing is a very new and largely state-controlled technology, right? So here are some things we know about Orphism. We know that proper Athenians understand it to be a low-class cult for ne'er-do-wells and foreigners and slaves and women and other undesirable people, right? Which I imagine is most of us are people that are perhaps undesirable to the Athenian state machine, right? We do know something about Orphic cosmology and sort of their ontology and how it differs from mainstream Greek religion, which is not mainstream ancient Greek religion. Like, if you went back in time to ancient Greece, by the way, a period of several thousand years that, like, basically covers from southern France to northern India, that's what ancient Greece means, right? Like, that's a lot of different people telling a lot of different stories over time. So what we think of as mainstream is not in any sense mainstream in ancient Greece. It's the ones that went through the people who know how to read and write, right? It's the ones that won, right? But we know that their cosmology is a little different, right? In particular, instead of focusing on the Olympians, right, it really has this core of, like, Dionysus. Zagreus is, to grossly oversimplify, Zagreus is an Orphic name for Dionysus. But I mean, you know, when things don't have bodies, the boundaries between them become less clear, right? So whenever you ask a question like, is this God the same as that God? I mean, I'm me and you're you, and I know because you're in your body and I'm in my body. But we all know that even as embodied humans, there are times when those boundaries between us blur, right? And if you don't even have a body, those boundaries are just always blurred, right? And Persephone Hecate, right? So the Orphics would call her Persephone, but she gets syncretized in with Hecate. So that's a goddess you see sort of all over like the Greek magical papyri, which are broadly sort of contemporaneous with the Orphic hymns as we know them today, right? We have these sort of primordial gods, the Titans and their parents, so like Gaia and Chaos, and elder Eros, right? There are two Eroses in Greek mythology. There's Eros, Cupid Eros, the son of Aphrodite, but there's also primordial Eros, right? Protogonos, the firstborn, is another name. In English, I think the best name for Protogonos is Lucifer. Like, that's who we mean, right? And that is the third creature to come into existence. I'm sorry?
The light bringer.
Yeah, the light bringer. But I don't just mean Lightbringer. I mean the entire package of Christian nonsense associated with the name Lucifer. I mean all of that when I say that's who Protogonos is. Like, you know what I mean? Like, that's all in there, right? He breaks down the lines between sensible and insensible. He makes pious men sin, but he makes sinners contemplate their actions. All of those things, right, are wrapped up in Protogonos, right? My favorite, perhaps, of the primordials, right? And so we have this idea in Orphism. This is one of the central things that distinguishes Orphism from other kinds of Grecophone paganism, right? So including like sort of the kind of Egyptian paganism we see in the Greek magical papyri, right? Which is not exactly Greek, right? And in fact, for most of those people, Greek was not their native language, right? But in Grecophone Egypt, and a lot of other things, right? What distinguishes Orphism from a lot of that is the Orphic mystery, which is essentially reincarnation, right? It is not within my power to communicate the Orphic mystery to you. If I could, I would. I wrote a book where I did my best. But the essence of the Orphic mystery, of the Orphic teaching, is that when you die, don't be afraid, right? Like, hold on to who you are, hold on to what you've learned, don't panic. That's the essence of the Orphic mystery, right? And so we can talk about like what Orphics think, but what we can really tell a little bit more about is what do Orphics do, right? Because as a magician, like my nun habit came off while I was trying to give this talk. I'm not sure how to interpret that, but I'm leaving it off. I'm going to talk more about sort of the practical, sort of hands in the dirt things about what Orphics do. But again, I want to remind you that most of what we know about what Orphics do, we didn't hear from Orphics, right? We heard from people who don't approve of Orphics. Orphism, in the way we use it today, is not really a religion. It is a style of religion. It is a style that, at least in the States, we would call charismatic, right? Like the same way we talk about charismatic Christians are like speaking in tongues and catching the spirit and handling snakes. That's the kind of practice we mean when we talk about Orphism, right? Charismatic, ecstatic, ecstasis. You are out of the static world, right? We know that there is sort of a central ritual of Orphism, which is a traveling ritual. So there's sort of this understanding that like a band of Orphics will come through town, right, and set up shop for a little while. And they'll do a lot of things. They'll do some healing. They're bards, right, so they're primarily entertainers, right, but they're also sacred teachers and initiators. Orpheotelestai, right, Orpheus initiators is sort of the word that Plato uses to talk about it, but he definitely thinks they're frauds. Like, he has bracketed them well out of existence, right? But according to people who don't approve of their rites, so they come into town and they do a lot of stuff, but one thing they do is out in the woods, out in the wilds, they throw a bacchanal, right? A ritual for Dionysus, right? And that is in some sense the central ritual of Orphism. I understand the Orphic hymns to be the liturgy of the great bacchanal. Most of us who use, I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but most of us when we talk about the Orphic hymns and we use them, we think about them individually. But the Orphic hymns, they're numbered. They go in a specific order. And if you read them in order, it will be immediately apparent to you, like as magicians, it will be immediately obvious that this is a continuous ritual from start to end, that it is a katabaxis ritual. It is a going under and coming back up transinduction ritual, right? I'm not going to try and convince you of that, but if you read them in order, it will be clear to you that it is true. So what we know about this ritual, right, we know from this outsider perspective. So we can kind of, if you're like hiding in the woods spying on them, but not in the circle, here's some stuff we know. We know that their rituals were possibly sometimes women only, but almost certainly women-led, a thing that was not approved of. We know that there's a procession, there's like a parade, right? We know that there are different like offices in that parade. Some of them dress up as animals. Foxes are particularly common, but other animals as well, right? We know that they have torches. Those torches are made of mullein, right? That's going to become relevant, so I'm going to throw this. I'm not going to talk about this much today, but like, here's a little thing to chew on. The sacred plants of Orphism are all biennial, right? So we have this understanding, right, when we talk about reincarnation as like, you know, the corn comes up and then it gets cut down, right, and it dies and it comes up again the next year. But you know, the corn that comes up the second year is not the same plant, right? It's the child of. But biennial plants, right, they grow and then they die back and then they flourish again, the same plant in a second year, right? And that is the plant metaphor in Orphism is always going to be biennial, right? This is a cult of dying and rising again while you still live. Right? We know that there are animals. We know that there's animal sacrifice. In a lurid sense, there is definitely an understanding those animals are ripped apart hand by hand and you feast on their still bleeding heart. How much of that is sort of drama and how much of it is true, I don't know. Many of us here in this room practice religions about which that kind of thing is said. Some of us probably do those sort of things, right? Like I'm like the dirty, nasty kind of witch, you know? Snake handling, we know. We know there's some kind of like, oh, they definitely have drugs. Unclear exactly what drugs, definitely wine. Something called the wine of Marone, which appears to be some kind of herbal infused wine, possibly with psilocybin, right? I am coming around to the idea that in the States we would call them liberty caps, the little psilocybin, right? That those are one of the central drugs of the Orphic religion, right? And we know there's some kind of initiatory levels, but we don't exactly understand. Like we have these names for Orphic practitioners, right? Mystics, that means they bear a wand. We have ox herders, which I understand to mean pastor, like which also means a shepherd, right? We have buckets, people who become possessed by buckets, but we don't exactly understand like the structure of how these things fit together, right? So in this context, we have the Orphic hymns, as I said, right? There are 88 of them. They're hymnos, hymns, right? Invocation songs to a variety of gods, right? So all the expected Greek gods, and some gods that are really quite obscure. So there are a couple of gods in the Orphic hymns that we have no other attestation to. And interestingly, there are several gods in the Orphic hymns for whom we had no other attestation, but are starting to dig their names up out of the ground in Turkey, right? There's a lot of evidence, not just mythologically, right? We're told that Orpheus comes from Thrace. There's also a lot of gathering archaeological evidence to support the idea that Orphic religion is imported into Greece, maybe from Anatolia, maybe from further to the east. And that was the understanding in Greece as well, that this was like newfangled, nasty foreign religion that they were not there for. Right? I believe Orphism to be, in some ways, continuations of very, very old, pre-literate, like, before the existence of writing, prehistorical religions of the Aegean Islands, right? And the coasts of the Aegean, right? So the Orphic hymns, as we know them, are from about 300 BCE to 300 CE. That's based on, like, I don't know, very sophisticated linguists tell me that about the language of them, the Greek itself, right? They were probably written in Pergamum. They're almost certainly in the version that we know, right? Written by a single person. But we also know that these same themes, that there were in circulation things called Orphic hymns, right? That we have a lot of commentary on, but we don't have those older hymns anymore. So the version we have is a relatively late version of this complex history. I'm going to go through a little bit of this textual history because I kind of want to save some time. I'll put these notes up in the group, so if you want to see them. So currently in English, as far as I know, there are 4 available translations. Thomas the Pagan Tailor, that's what his contemporaries called him. They did not approve of his lack of ontological bracketing in his translations and his scholarship. It is said that he sacrificed a goat in his yard every time he finished a translation. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's a thing that people said about him. So I assume it had some aspect of truth to it, right? His are very rhythmic. They're in rhymed couplets, and they're quite loose translations. So that's sort of how I got into, that's how I fell down this rabbit hole. Sometimes I would read them and I'd be like, that doesn't sound like something someone in ancient Greece would say. Maybe I'm going to go check the Greek. And the more I did that, of course my Greek improved, but also like my understanding of the hymns improved, right? Apostolos Athanasakis is a very academic, very literal translation. It has very useful footnotes. As a magician, I will say like his intention in translating is not to make magic. And personally, I would say the very notion of a literal translation of sacred poetry, to my way of thinking, like fundamentally misunderstands what poetry is, right? But it's a very useful translation. Like what I'm gonna say is you should triangulate between all available ones. So my translation you can buy back at the table. My focus, I really thought to myself, here's my goal in translating. I think to myself, if Orpheus were writing this in modern English, what would he say? That's my goal, right? And I'm doing that as tightly as I can to the Greek, right? Okay, so I want to talk about, of these hymns, I want to talk about how to use them in magic, and then I'm going to come back and talk a little bit about this list, but apparently I don't have a slide for this. Oh, I do. Okay, right? So there's a couple different ways to use them. The way most people use them is simply as devotional prayers, right? So we heard the ones for the planetary deities are the ones I hear used the most. I am in no way saying people shouldn't do that, right? I'm saying I don't necessarily use them that way, which is because the hymns, like the god Ares and the planet Mars are not identical, right? And in some of the hymns more than others, that distinction, like Kronos and Saturn, for example, like the Kronos hymn is like not actually very well suited to Saturnian work, right? So for those reasons, I don't necessarily have it, but like there's nothing wrong with that practice. It's well established, it worked great. It's not that I never do it. I do it in ritual with other people. But like, there are a lot of other ones, and I encourage you to experiment with them as well. That's really what I'm saying. You can use them as invocations, right? Which is how I understand them. Like, to me, that is their essential function. They are a thing that helps you be inspired, and by inspired, I mean straight up possessed, right? The spirit is inside of you, right? So there's this continuum from like quieter inspiration, right, to just full-on transpossession. And at least in Orphism and in my practice, that is understood to be like a spectrum of experience with no clear boundaries at all, right? And the goal of these hymns is to inculcate we can say a frame of consciousness, but I prefer to say a way of being, right? That is the daimon, right? The spirit you are calling in that invocation, right? If you use them from front to back, you get a basically 12-hour-long night ritual that begins at sunset and ends shortly after sunrise, right? And that is the liturgy of the Great Bacchanal. If you read carefully, you will see that the hymns talk about it as a game or a contest. We don't exactly know what the contest is. I imagine it to be an epic rap battle, personally. Right? And finally, as magicians, I think the way I encourage people to use the most is as petitions, right? They're sort of like a letter to a god saying what you want. And when we use them in that way, they have sort of a very clear structure, which is mimicked by a lot of other Greek petition magic, and because that has diffused in your culture, like in a lot of Anglophone magic. And that is to say, the first thing you're going to do is say who you're talking to, like you're going to address your petition, and you're going to do that with like a lot of epithets and names, right? And that's sort of to help you zero in on exactly what you want. You're going to move from epithets into what we call historiola, which are tiny little snippets of myth. So one of the things that I did when I translated them is sometimes those snippets of myth, like the person who was intended to be hearing this hymn definitely knew what they were talking about, but I didn't, right, when I read it. So sometimes I will expand the historiola a little bit to give a little more context. But it's just a callback to a story you already know. Like if I'm like Noah and the Ark, I don't have to tell that whole story, y'all know what I'm talking about, right? That's a historiola, right? From there we move into, you just kind of butter them up a little bit. Like you're going to bring up, as you, in Judaism, I came up Jewish, in Judaism we say, as you did for my ancestors of old, right? You're going to say like, oh, these historiola, I mentioned them to remind you that you do, this thing I'm about to ask you to do, you've done it before, like you're supposed to do it, right? And at the end, right, there's going to be a direct request. And in some of them, it's sort of like vague, like attend to my ritual and give me insight. That's a good magic, but some of them it's much more literal, right? Like, heal me. Drive away this difficult ghost, right? I'm going to recommend to you that in my translation, it's always going to be the final couplet. In the Greek or in other people's translation, it's going to be the bit at the end. You can take that out and write a new couplet to put in to like specify exactly what you want. So that's what I do usually when I use them in magic, right? So when we talk about them, right, these are sort of, I just kind of thought about the ones I personally use the most. So for me, Hygeia, right? There were 2 hymns for healing in the Orphic hymns, 2 broad, I don't want to say there are only 2 Greek gods of healing, there are like thousands of them, right? But there's 2 generally. Asclepios, right, the great surgeon, right, who invented what we would call like modern medicine, right? He's a son of Apollo. So I usually use his hymn for like acute, the sort of things that I think Western medicine is good at. Like if I break my arm, I'm gonna go to the hospital. But if I have like a melancholy in my soul, I personally have not found Western medicine very effective for that, right? So for acute things, if somebody's in the hospital, I use the Asclepios hymn. For broader healing, for recovery, right? So long-term, for mental health and for chronic illness, I use Hygeia, who in mainstream Greek mythology is understood to be Asclepios' daughter, but in Orphism and in the cult of Asclepios and Hygeia is understood to be Asclepios' wife. Again, through this sort of modern bracketing, she's often described as like a goddess of nursing, but her name means health, and his name means scalpel, right? She's the goddess of medicine, right? She holds the pharmaceutical cup, right? So her symbol is a chalice with a snake wound around it, right? Because medicine and poison are identical, right? Like she's the goddess of medicine, qua medicine, and also medicine as a synonym for magic, right? Which I hear less than I used to, but that's a real thing. That's Hygeia, and so that is definitely my number one. I use it all the time, that's like my go-to, right? Pan, I love Pan, and I also love his hymn. Pan, so the Greek word Pan does mean everything, right? But Pan's name actually comes from a different root, probably. It's the same Indo-European root as the English word pasture. So I think of Pan very specifically as the everythingness of the pasture. So if you maybe eat some psilocybin and you chill on a hill and you look at the sheep and you look at the clouds and the sheep dance in the sky and the clouds come down to talk to you and you experience the everythingness of the meadow, that's Pan, right? So the ask, the request at the end of Pan's hymn is that you banish the gadflies of madness, right? Particularly in the context of trance possession and drugs, right? So when I'm saying bracha, we would say in Judaism, when I'm blessing drugs, just like we bless food, I encourage you to also bless drugs, right? The Orphic hymn to Pan is an excellent choice for that. Also, I'll say, so my book is illustrated. The illustrator is my friend Chase. The Pan illustration, amazing. I'll show it to you at the end. It's maybe my favorite one. He's playing the djembe because he originally had a giant erect penis, and we decided that was too much, so we gave him a drum in front of it. But I assure you there's a big dick behind that drum. Hermes is a god I really love. My hair is probably too long. I don't know if you can see. I have Hermes wings tattooed behind my ears. I understand my primary, not necessarily my primary practice as a magician, but as a like outward-facing public magician is as a hermeneutes, right? Like I Hermes for people as a profession. Yeah, absolutely, right? And so the word hermeneutes in Greek applies to gods, but it also applies to like people, right? So a translator or a go-between or a negotiator, or if anybody's seen the TV show Rome, Pasca, like Caesar's slave Pasca, is a hermeneutes. That's the exact, like that's the job description of a hermeneutes. Hermes I use for like smooth communication, for safe travel. When the projector won't work, maybe you whisper the hymn to Hermes to it. That's a go-to. Nemesis. I'm going to how much time do I have left? Enough?
You have 5 minutes.
All right, okay, I'm going to go real fast. I'm going to talk about nemesis a little bit. In English, nemesis means enemy, but nemesis is the goddess who rights the scales. When the scales of justice have become out of balance, she balances them. Like the idea that nemesis means enemy, you gotta think about whose enemy nemesis is, and it's not the people's enemy, right? Like she's on, like every person in mythology you've heard nemesis chase down and murder definitely deserved it. Like read those stories again. The Titans, I just love. Their hymn is for, I'm sorry?
Come on.
Yeah, exactly. She's the dark sister of Tyche, the goddess of fortune. Like she rights the scales. Right, DK for justice I use in court cases. Hypnos, I sometimes use it for sleep, but my friends with little kids tell me that the Orphic hymn to Hypnos will put little kids out. Like in English or in Greek, if you read the Orphic hymn to Hypnos, it will put a baby to sleep. I don't have kids, I don't know if that's true, but I've had many different people report that to me long before I translated the hymns, right? Oneiros for dreams I use a lot, and the Muses for inspiration. And then the final one I want to talk about is Mnemosyne for learning. So I took this one for us today. Mnemosyne, the mother of the Muses, right? Her name means memory. She's the goddess of memory. In Latin, one of her names is moneda, which is where we get our word money. Money is the memory of trade, right? Also, the Bank of Rome was on top of a temple to Juno Moneda, so you know, how chicken and the egg situation about how those words come to be, right? But this is Mnemosyne's hymn. Remember that Mnemosyne is the grandmother of Orpheus, right? Like he is a child of the Muses. Musaios, by the way, the name I talked about earlier, means like muse touched. In addition to being Orpheus's teacher and Orpheus's son, it is also just a term for someone who has had a muse initiation, a Musaios, right? So if anybody wants to close their eyes and sort of open your heart to the goddess of memory and learning, I'm going to read her hymn for you. I summon Mnemosyne's all brilliant gleam, beloved goddess of memory, Teutonic queen, consort and lover of Cronian Zeus's, mother of the musical numinous muses. You are free from all trauma that damages souls. You mend minds and make us whole. Merciful monarch, empower our minds as all of our memories you lovingly entwine. Treasure forever each thought in your heart. Awaken our minds, never, never depart. Banish forgetfulness from this sanctified rite. Bless mystic memory and bring truth to light. So in Orphism, we don't say amen, we say woo! Yeah, it's a pig call, it's a squeal of a pig. Woo! 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 So that's my talk. I am happy to take any questions.
Okay. Do we have any questions for Sarah? Yes.
With the idea that there may have been wine, maybe psilocybin, or maybe and
I don't think ergot for botanical and historical reasons, but yes.
Would there be any sort of validity to the idea that maybe the perception in the real world is a metaphor for ego death?
Yes, but a lot of people think it's actually an induced near-death experience. So at Eleusis, we have this other potion called Eleusis is sort of the heart of the Persephone mysteries, right? So if you really want to go below and come back up. So I will say, by far the most profound mystic experience of my life was in the Plutonian cave at Eleusis. But at Eleusis, they have a different potion called Kykeon, which many people think is full of pennyroyal, right? So there's reason to believe it's maybe not metaphoric. They're going to induce a terrible, terrible near-death experience. But yes, also ego death.
I like the idea of you receiving mysteries, so certainly the Demeter as well, that could play a role with the sort of peace.
Yeah, definitely. I don't know enough. I think no, but here's what I will say. my guess is that just like in Orphic rites today, which drug you get kind of depends on which Orphic, like, I've gone to a variety of Orphic rites, and I've definitely done Orphic rites on LSD and on mushrooms, and a lot of things I'm not supposed to say out loud in this country, I don't know. But you know, depending which rite you go to, you get a different drug. That would be my guess in the ancient world. And the same way about sort of other things, like other aspects of it. We talk about Orphism in general, but one imagines every sort of traveling circus troupe of Orphics kind of had their own thing.
Anybody else? No? Thank you, Sarah. That was fantastic.
Thank you guys so much.
Okay, it is your last opportunity to browse our lovely store.